Before we begin, I feel it's necessary to go on a slight preamble. I have always loved history, and I have always loved a good narration documentary. Now, I get to make one of my own. I will illustrate throughout this video series that Photoshop was developed in the film era in 1987 by brothers Thomas and John Knoll. It was meant to be intuitive with people who worked with film photography. At that time, Photoshop was known as Image Pro. John Knoll's brother worked at Industrial Light and Magic. Yes, that Industrial Light and Magic. And saw the potential of his brother's Image Pro. He helped promote it and developed it into a full app. They teamed up with Adobe and released the first version of the app in 1990. And as they say, the rest is history. It is also impossible to tell the history of photo editing without covering a bit of video editing, history, photography, and printing. So I will also have to cover those subjects briefly, and as well as a bit of science. We will briefly be covering the history of pre-photography because I believe it is fundamental to understand the motivation behind photo editing and manipulation of images. I am going to be defining how I'm going to be using the terms editing and manipulation. My definition of manipulation: to manipulate an image is to take out something that was part of the original photo or to add something in that was not a part of the original photo. My definition of editing is to bring out more detail that was part of the original image, or to adjust the colors of the image, or to decrease or increase the exposure and the contrast, as well as adjusting the highlights and the shadows. Now, with the preamble done, let's get into talking about the prehistory of photography. Like this example of this painting that currently resides at the Met, where they had their slave painted out of the original image. People have been covering up very uncomfortable truths for a very long time. On a later note, most lighthouses are painted in more spectacular places than they actually are, such as the Oak Island, North Carolina lighthouse located in the United States that I've taken of it, and here's a montage of paintings of it. For the moment, sticking with paintings, do you think that all the kings, emperors, and warriors, presidents and prime ministers, flawless skin? Of course they didn't. They painted them with those flaws removed. Now, let's move on to statues. For example, in ancient Greece and Rome, high-up officials got a full statue commissioned, while lesser officials got a head commissioned, and they had the shuttle for picking out a stock body. Swapping people's heads on the other people's bodies has been done for a very long time. The reasons for manipulating and editing image were this as varied as they were back then as they are now. Sometimes it's for entertainment value, like in this fake photo of fairies, the spooled Sir Arthur Conan Doyle author of the Sherlock Holmes novels. That's right, people were trolling even back then. Some, like these 18th century photos, were done for the fun of it. Also, people who were simply unhappy with their appearance would want retouching done for that image as well, like in these examples of these Victorian photos. Sometimes political figures wanted to look more grandiose than they actually are, like in this photo of Mussolini. Mussolini had the sky changed in the photo and the stable boy removed. Or like in this example with Joseph Stalin, who often had his rivals murdered or imprisoned, he would have them removed from the photos he was in with them. Sometimes, like in this example, they would use these techniques to satirize some of the most notable famous political figures of the day. Like this example by Helmut Hirschfeld, a satire of the most famous dictator. Sometimes, like today, it was for marketing reasons, like in this old Victorian photo, or vanity reasons, like in this other Victorian photo. Sometimes they just wanted to experiment, like in this example of Abraham Lincoln's body being swapped onto John Calhoun's photo by Thomas Hicks. This is quite funny because John Calhoun was a notorious racist. This is meant to troll the critics who said Abraham Lincoln looked unstatesmanlike. Sometimes they manipulated images for artistic reasons, like some of the documented examples by Calvert Richards Jones, one of the first recorded examples in 1841 of photo manipulation. He painted over one of the monks because he didn't like where he was in the photo. Now, how did they do this before Photoshop? I will show how they did it and show how much Photoshop references the old analog ways of doing things. In part 2, we're going to stop by looking at the channel panel in Photoshop. We're going to start with the RGB channels, red, green, and blue. Then we will cover the multi-channel mode and the CMYK channel mode. Through going over these, we will be covering the history of color photography, as well as color printing and, of course, editing and manipulation. In part 3, we're going to be exploring the history behind the layer mask and adjustment tools and selection tools in Photoshop. Thank you for watching. If you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe and turn the bell notification on. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram. You can support me on Redbubble, Society6, and Adobe Stock.